The first time I realized Dana Mercer was going to erase me, she was already standing in front of slide 47 with my work on the wall behind her. The room was cold glass, gray carpet, and $600 million worth of fake smiles. Helix National Freight's executives sat on one side of the table. My company's leadership sat on the other. Everyone was acting like we were minutes away from a historic win. Dana clicked her remote, and the architecture summary I had built over 14 months filled the screen. The transition map, the risk gates, the rollout sequence that would let Helix rebuild a failing freight network without destroying payroll, dispatch, compliance, or customer service. My structure, my language, my model. But my name was gone. Where my authorship line used to be, on a white box now read, Executive Solution Lead, Dana Mercer. I did not move. I just stared at the screen. When you build something that complex, you know every inch of it. You know which lines came from midnight workshops. You know which assumptions took 3 weeks to prove. You know which sentence exists because legal refused to sign the first version. I knew that slide the way some people know their own face. My name is Amelia Grant. I was 41 then, Senior Director of Enterprise Solution Architecture at Halcyon Strategic Systems, and I had spent 9 years fixing the kind of enterprise messes other people loved to sell and could never deliver. I was never the loudest person in the room. I was the person they called after the loud people left behind a promise nobody could actually keep. Dana knew that better than anyone. She was our Chief Growth Officer. Perfect posture, perfect voice. The kind of executive who could make a room confuse polish with substance. She knew how to look inevitable. She also knew how much of this deal I had built. And as I said earlier, she told the Helix team, smiling like the architecture belonged to her, we designed this implementation path to protect continuity during the first 90 days while still accelerating savings. We designed. That one word did a lot of work. Across the table, Priya Nair from Helix watched the slide without speaking. She had spent enough hours with me to know Dana had not built that model. But fast rooms protect powerful people. Nobody wants to stop a victory lap and ask who actually did the work. Dana kept going. She used my phrasing almost line for line, even my pause before the risk ladder. And I sat there with a legal pad in front of me and my hands folded so nobody could see how tight they were. Then Paul Denning, our CEO, leaned back and said, I want to recognize Dana here. She really architected this pursuit from the top down. A few people nodded. Dana smiled with just enough restraint to make the praise look natural. That was the moment the insults stopped being private. Helix was still in the room. My team was still in the room, and I was still in the room. I had led the ugly workshops. I had rebuilt the savings model after 2 rival firms gave Helix numbers that would have collapsed in real life. I had spent nights with operations, labor, security, and legal turning executive promises into something that would not fail. Now my own CEO was handing all of it to a woman who arrived near the end to polish the story. Paul looked at me like he had almost forgotten I existed. Amelia will support transition where needed, he said. If you have never worked in a room like that, let me translate. It means we are taking your authority, your money, and your seat at the table, and we are doing it with clean language so nobody has to feel guilty. Dana thanked him and moved on. I kept my face still. People like Dana count on emotion. Anger can be called unstable. Hurt can be managed. Protest can be framed as ego. So I gave them none of that. I took notes. Then Dana moved into the legal readiness section, and that was when I understood she had made a catastrophic mistake. Most people in the room only heard safe executive language: governance, mobilization, diligence support, risk controls. I heard the structure under it. I heard assumptions tied to named memos. I heard liability pricing tied to certification paths. I heard her standing on a document chain that could only survive scrutiny if the original architect could defend it. Dana could sell certainty. She could not survive verification. As the presentation ended, Helix's general counsel flipped through the diligence binder and placed a yellow tab on one of the reference pages. It was a tiny movement. Nobody else noticed. I did, because I knew what was in that section: my workshop memos, my version history, my risk certification language. Dana stood there accepting congratulations. Paul looked pleased with himself. Half the room was already glowing in that early light people get when they think they have won. But what Dana stole was not just a deck. It was a legal structure, an operational structure, a trust structure. And structures do not care who smiles best in a boardroom. They care who can hold weight when the questions start. Dana thought she had taken my spotlight. What she had actually done was put her name on $600 million worth of assumptions she could not explain if Helix's legal team asked one simple question: who built this? By the time the meeting ended, I already knew something the people clapping for her did not. They had not buried me. They had tied themselves to me and then tried to pretend I was gone. That kind of mistake always gets expensive. The applause was still echoing down the hall when Nina Bell from HR asked if I had just a few minutes. That phrase always means the opposite. She led me into a smaller conference room with frosted glass and no view. One of Paul's operating deputies was already there, me sitting too straight, with a folder placed neatly in front of him. The room smelled like burnt coffee and carpet cleaner. It was the kind of room companies use when they want something ugly to feel administrative. Nina gave me a sympathetic expression so practiced it barely counted as human. "Amelia, this is just about alignment going forward," she said. That was my first warning. The second was the folder. They did not fire me because that would have been too honest. Instead, they handed me a restructuring packet. My role on the Helix account was being refined. My variable compensation on the deal was being reduced. My team would now report into Dana's office for transition planning. I would remain available in a specialized support capacity. Then I saw the line that told me exactly what they were trying to do. I'm supporting pre-sales analysis. That was how they described me. 14 months of leadership buried under 5 polite words. I read the packet twice, not because I was confused, because I wanted to see how far they were willing to go in writing. Helix was not just a deal to me, it was the hardest thing I had built in years. I had spent nights rebuilding their failed transition model after 2 rival firms handed them savings projections that would have blown up in real operations. I earned Priya Nair's trust by telling the truth when other people were still performing confidence. I carried the technical risk in every steering call while Dana floated in near the end to package the commercials. They were not just taking a bonus away from me, they were trying to overwrite my professional identity. Nina folded her hands and said, "We know change can feel personal." I looked up and said, "This is personal." Her smile tightened. The deputy stepped in with the usual corporate sedative. "No one is diminishing your contribution. We're just clarifying account leadership." That almost made me laugh. Clarifying was a lovely word for lying fast enough to make it look official. I asked who approved the staffing change before contract execution. He said, "Senior leadership." I asked whether internal legal had reviewed the new authorship language. That question landed harder. Nina glanced at him before she answered. "The documents are being handled appropriately." That is not an answer. It is a curtain. I asked them to send every instruction in writing. Then I pushed the packet back across the table. "I'm not signing this today," I said. Nina's voice got cooler. We do need timely cooperation." "Then you should have brought accurate paperwork." For the first time, nobody in the room pretended this was friendly. The deputy opened the handover checklist, probably hoping to corner me into practicality. Instead, he showed me the first crack in their entire plan. There were 3 items they wanted from me before Dana's office took over: the full assumption register, the dependency ladder behind the savings model, and the implementation risk thresholds used to price liability. I read the list once and felt something inside me go very still. Nobody else at Halcyon could explain those 3 things cleanly because I had built them from scratch. They were the logic holding the deal together. The assumptions told you why the promised savings might happen. The dependency ladder showed what had to happen first so the client did not break its own network chasing those savings. The risk thresholds were the guardrails that kept a $600 million promise from turning into a lawsuit. They had removed my name from the room, but they still needed my brain to keep the deal alive. That changed everything. Up until then, I had been holding the humiliation in my chest like heat. Now it cooled into focus. Because once a company tries to erase you while still depending on work only you can defend, the game changes. It stops being about respect. It becomes about leverage. At Halcyon, leverage was never loud. It lived in records, dependencies, approvals, and the silence that falls when executives realize the person they sidelined is the only one who can save them. I stood, collected the packet, and said I would review it with care. Nina tried one last soft line. "We really hope you'll be collaborative here." I looked at the checklist in my hand and said, "That depends on whether you want collaboration or fiction." Then I walked out with the folder under my arm and the first clear thought I had all day. They had taken my title off the deal. They had not taken me out of it. Back at my desk, I closed the door, muted my phone, and opened the Helix contract repository. I did not do anything dramatic. I did not sneak into some restricted server or forward files to a personal account like an idiot in a legal thriller. I used the access I still had because until someone formally removed it, I was still part of the account structure. And more important than that, I already knew where the truth lived. Not in the glossy presentation Dana had just hijacked, in the documents beneath it. That is the thing most people outside deals like this never see. The presentation is theater. The contract is the skeleton. You can repaint the outside all day, but if the bones still point to the wrong person, the whole body starts to fail the second anyone leans on it. I opened the latest draft agreement first, then the staffing exhibits, then the risk memos, then the diligence tracker. And within 10 minutes, I understood exactly how dangerous Dana's little performance had been. The cover pages had changed. The executive summaries had been cleaned up. My name had been softened in places where they thought people would look first. But the real structure was still there, buried in the parts that mattered. First, the draft agreement still included a key person provision tied to mobilization. In plain English, that meant Helix had priced part of the deal assuming one named person would certify the design before the work went live. That named person was me. Not my department, not my team, me, Amelia Grant. Second, the liability cap on the deal had been shaped by a risk memo I wrote after weeks of workshops with Helix operations, legal, security, and labor transition staff. That memo was not a side note. It explained where the real failure points were and how we had priced around them. If that logic was wrong, the client could face service collapse. If the pricing based on that logic was wrong, my company could get torn apart later. Dana had put her name on the story. Mine was still attached to the risk. Third, the staffing exhibit assumed continuity between the person who designed the transition path and the person who would validate the first 90 days after launch. That sounds technical, but it is actually simple. The client wanted the same brain that built the map to confirm they were following it once the real pressure started. Dana had changed the slide deck. She had not changed the deal. because she could not. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. Not because I was shocked anymore, because the pattern was so stupid it was almost elegant. They had stolen authorship on the outside while leaving authorship in the legal core. They had rewritten status but not responsibility. And then I understood why Helix's legal team was the real danger to them. Helix Legal had not just seen my name once, and they had been copied on months of workshop memos because those sessions touched labor transfer rules, data handling obligations, dispatch continuity, and implementation liability. They knew who had asked the hard questions. They knew who had answered theirs. They had version histories. They had tracked comments. They had watched the model become real. If they compared the final client-facing story to the actual diligence trail, the mismatch would be obvious. Dana Mercer was being presented as the architect, but I was the one whose fingerprints were on every load-bearing surface. And legal people do not care who smiles best in a boardroom. They care who can defend the assumptions when something is on the line. That was the moment this stopped feeling like a workplace insult and started feeling like a structural trap. Because now I could see the only path Dana had left. For her theft to hold, she would eventually need to survive detailed questioning about work she had never done. She would need to explain why one rollback trigger sat where it did in the transition path. She would need to explain why certain labor moves had to happen before systems migration instead of after. She would need to explain why the liability thresholds were priced the way they were. She would need to explain my thinking without having my thinking. And Dana was good, but she was not that good. She knew enough to sound certain in front of executives. She did not know enough to survive verification by people whose job was to pull certainty apart. I remember looking at the contract language again and thinking, very calmly, I do not need revenge theater. And I do not need leaked emails. I do not need shouting. I do not need a dramatic hallway scene where she admits everything. I just need the truth to arrive in the right room. Once that happened, the size of the lie would do the rest. Because this was no longer about one ambitious executive stealing credit from the quiet woman in the corner. This was about a live $600 million deal that might have misrepresented who actually built the model behind it. And when money gets that big, truth has a way of becoming everybody's problem. Once I understood where the leverage really was, I stopped thinking like someone who had just been humiliated and started thinking like someone building a case. Not a lawsuit, not yet. A structure. There is a difference. Anger wants release. Structure wants sequence. So I made myself a coffee I did not drink, opened a fresh notebook, and started building a timeline they would never be able to talk around. I pulled workshop invites from the past 14 months. I matched them to meeting notes, comment threads, redline drafts, risk committee decks, steering summaries, and pricing approvals. I marked who attended, what changed, and when those changes moved from theory into contract language. I cross-checked version history against executive review dates. I tracked which documents fed the liability model and which ones fed staffing assumptions. By midnight, my desk looked like a crime scene designed by someone who respected folder naming conventions. And that was exactly the point. I was not trying to create drama. I was trying to make lying expensive. That is the cleanest form of corporate revenge I know. You do not scream. You do not threaten. You build a record so precise that anyone trying to distort it has to step over timestamps, approvals, and their own email trail to do it. The next morning, I drafted one memo. Just one. I did not send it to Dana. I did not send it to Paul. I did not send it to HR because HR exists to manage exposure, not truth. I sent it to internal legal. The memo was short, dry, and almost boring on purpose. I wrote that I had identified a possible discrepancy between current public authorship claims around the Helix solution and the documented basis for certain contractual assumptions tied to certification, liability, and staffing continuity. I recommended preserving all related records pending clarification. That was it. No accusation. A no emotional language. No, as you know. No poisoned adjectives. Just a calm statement of risk. It was enough. Inside a company like Halcyon, the moment legal sees the words discrepancy, contractual assumptions, and preserve records in the same paragraph, the air changes. Casual rewriting becomes harder. Slack edits slow down. People stop cleaning up language that should have been left alone. By lunchtime, I got a reply from Marianne Cho in internal legal. Marianne was not my friend. She was not anyone's friend in the warm office sense of the word. She was practical, exact, and almost aggressively unimpressed by personality. If a building was on fire, Marianne would ask which floor, who authorized the wiring, and whether the documentation matched the load. Her reply was one line. Please send complete chronology and supporting references. That line did more for me than sympathy ever could have. It told me two things. First, she took the issue seriously. Second, she was already thinking in evidence, not politics. So I gave her evidence. While I was doing that, Dana's office sent a request for a transition memo. The wording was polished, almost cheerful. They needed a summary of key assumptions, account knowledge, and implementation guardrails to support seamless executive continuity. I read it twice and smiled for the first time in 2 days, because there it was again. Executive continuity. They were still trying to build legitimacy out of my silence. I replied with 3 questions and nothing else. Who is the designated solution certifier under the current draft agreement? Has the client approved the staffing substitution prior to mobilization? Has counsel reviewed the updated authorship language for consistency with diligence records? I did not accuse anyone of anything. I did not refuse to help. I simply asked factual questions that honest people could answer, and dishonest people could only delay. That is one of the best tricks I ever learned in corporate life. A direct accusation starts a fight. A clean factual question starts a timer. Dana did what I expected. Nothing at first. Then a short reply from one of her deputies saying the team was working through alignment. That phrase again. Alignment is what executives say when the truth is inconvenient, but not fully dead yet. Over the next 2 days, I kept building the chronology. I added timestamps showing when my memos had been cited in pricing reviews. I tagged the exact version where the key person clause named me, and I marked the point where Dana's name started appearing on summary pages without corresponding authorship in the actual work. The more complete the timeline became, the calmer I felt. That surprised me. Humiliation burns hot. Evidence cools it. By the time I sent Marianne the full packet, I was no longer thinking about the boardroom where Dana smiled under my work. I was thinking about load-bearing truth. Dana still believed she was managing a bruised employee. She thought my quiet meant she had won. What she could not see was that every step she took now left a mark. Every revision, every email, every soft lie and polished language landed against a record I had already locked into sequence. I had stopped trying to defend my dignity. I was building a field of timestamps. And if Dana kept walking the way I knew she would, sooner or later she was going to trip over one in front of somebody who mattered. If Dana had done the smart thing after that, she might have survived. If she had gone quiet, cleaned up the language, pulled back the public claims, and let the deal close with less ego attached to it, she might have had room to lie her way into safety. But people like Dana almost never stop when they first get away with something. They mistake early silence for permanent victory. 3 days after I sent my chronology to Marianne, Halcyon released a press statement about the Helix win. I read it from my desk with my jaw set and my coffee going cold beside me. The statement praised Dana Mercer for personally architecting the Helix transformation framework, calling the deal a result of her leadership, strategic design, and execution discipline. It was the kind of language communications teams love because it sounds sharp and expensive. It was also stupid in a way that only overconfident people can afford for about 5 minutes. They could have kept it vague. They could have said leadership team, enterprise group, company-wide effort. Instead, they planted a flag on a lie, and then Paul made it worse. On the investor call that afternoon, he used the deal to showcase Dana's strength as an operator. I listened through one earbud while pretending to review staffing models. He said Helix proved Halcyon could originate and architect transformation at scale under Dana's leadership. Originate and architect. It would have been almost funny if it were not attached to a live contract. Once words like that leave internal walls, they stop being office politics. They become representations. Investors hear them, clients hear them, board members hear them, and later, when legal starts asking who knew what and when, those polished little lies come back with timestamps attached. Dana was not protecting herself. She was widening the blast radius. Inside the company, she was just as reckless. She installed Colin Rusk as my replacement in a transition meeting with the Helix workstream. Colin was exactly the kind of man executives confuse for readiness. Tall, smooth, expensive haircut, always holding the latest deck like he personally invented alignment. He had a talent for speaking in finished sentences about work other people had done. But Helix was not a branding exercise. It was a chain of dependencies. If you touched one part carelessly, 3 other parts cracked. I joined the meeting because my name was still on the attendee list and nobody had been stupid enough to remove me yet. Dana sat at the head of the table. Colin took over my old section like he was sliding into a reserved seat at dinner. He started walking Helix through transition readiness and got maybe 6 minutes before the bluff showed. He mixed up the labor migration sequence with the systems migration path. To most people, that probably sounded minor. Just 2 lines in a complicated program. But the difference mattered. One sequence affected staffing law, local approvals, and who could legally handle which functions during the first phase. The other affected dispatch tools, freight tracking, and operational continuity. Swap those in real life and you do not just create confusion. You create exposure. And I watched Priya's face flatten by half an inch. Then Colin talked about the rollback plan. That was worse. He described it like a standard safety net, which sounded fine until you understood that the Helix rollback trigger had been designed to stop a cascading failure between labor transition and systems cutover. It was not generic. It sat exactly where it did for a reason. Dana jumped in to rescue him. She said, "The team built that sequence to give us flexibility if the commercial case changes." No. That was not what it was for, and anyone who had actually built the model knew it. It was there to protect continuity if operational stress hit before savings did. In plain English, it was there to stop the client from breaking itself in pursuit of the promised upside. I said nothing. That was the strangest part. The silence. Not because I was afraid, but because I could feel the trap tightening in real time. Every confident mistake they made was becoming part of a larger record. After the meeting, Dana's office sent me a revised transition document for reference. I opened it and found the new lie tucked into the middle like it belonged there. Executive led by Dana Mercer with architecture support from Amelia Grant. I stared at that line for a long moment. Then I replied in writing. I said the description was inaccurate, that the design record did not support that language, and that they should confirm with counsel whether the statement needed correction before external reliance increased. That last phrase was deliberate, before external reliance increased, because now they knew I was not confused. I was not emotional. I was not frozen. I was watching them build a false record anyway. Dana never answered me directly. One of her deputies sent back a vague note about ongoing alignment across stakeholders. But that was enough. It always is when the right people are already reading. Dana thought repetition could make authorship real. I knew it could only make the correction more brutal when it finally came. The email came at 5:12 in the morning. I know the time because I was already awake. When a company is trying to erase you while still depending on your work, your body stops sleeping properly. You learn to wake up before alarms, before sunlight, before reason. The subject line was simple. Helix diligence follow-up. Immediate clarifications required. I sat up in bed and opened it. The note was from Helix's legal team, copied to internal legal, Paul, Dana, you and a handful of people who suddenly had a very bad morning ahead of them. They wanted 4 things before final signature pages were released. Authorship lineage for the architecture exhibits, confirmation of the current solution certifier, an explanation for the staffing change before mobilization, and a live session with the original architect, whose assumptions shaped the liability model. I read that phrase twice. The original architect. There it was in plain language, like a knife laid gently on a table. The exact question Dana had spent days trying to bury had now arrived from the one group she could not charm, bully, or outpolish. I was still holding my phone when the first calendar invite hit. Urgent alignment, then another. Executive review, then another with no title at all, which is how panic looks in corporate systems. People stop naming things when they are afraid of records. By 6:30, Nina Bell had called me twice. She left one voicemail, careful and polished. Amelia, we'd really value a collaborative posture here. There are a few things we need to align on before the client discussion. Collaborative posture. There it was again. The language companies use when they want your help, but not your truth. At 7:04, Dana sent me a private note. It was the first direct message she had sent me since she took my work and smiled over it in front of Helix. The tone was almost warm. She wrote that she had always intended for me to play a critical role, that the pace of the deal had created messaging gaps, and that there was an opportunity to reset this internally if I helped the team stay consistent in the client meeting. She even mentioned compensation. I'm saying she was prepared to revisit part of my structure once the deal was safely executed. I read it once and set the phone down on my nightstand. It was almost elegant in how dishonest it was. Flatter me, minimize the lie, offer back part of what they stole, and, most important, ask me to help them stay consistent. Not honest, consistent. That is a very different word. Honesty tells the truth. Consistency protects the story already chosen. By then I was fully calm. That always happens at the worst moment. Once the danger stops being abstract, I get quieter. I replied from my kitchen table with the sun just starting to come through the window. I wrote that I would respond truthfully to any direct client or legal questions regarding my work, and that any process matters should be handled through counsel. Nothing more. No emotion. No accusation. No bargaining. It was the cleanest answer I could give, and because it was so clean, it frightened them. I could feel that before anyone said it. At 8:11, Marianne sent the notice that changed the mood across the entire Helix account. Formal preservation instruction effective immediately. All records related to pursuit history, authorship, staffing decisions, diligence materials, and external statements are to be preserved pending review. That was the legal hold. Once it hits, the air changes. People stop joking in side chats. Deputies stop cleaning up language. Executives get careful with every sentence because now the company itself is admitting there may be something worth preserving. An emergency meeting was scheduled for the next morning. Paul, Dana, Marianne, Helix Legal, Helix Operations, one board representative, and me. For days, they had been working to push me out of the room. Now the room had been rebuilt around me, and for the first time since Dana put her name over mine, I knew exactly where this was going. Not because I believed in fairness, because I believed in pressure, and pressure had finally reached the people who mattered. The due diligence meeting was held in one of Helix's smaller legal conference rooms, which told me everything I needed to know before anyone spoke. It was not built for celebration. It was built for facts. No polished catering, no giant presentation wall, no long executive table meant for speeches. Just a rectangular room with a speakerphone in the center, frosted glass, a legal pad at every seat, and that dry, over-filtered air offices always seemed to reserve for bad days. On Helix's side sat their general counsel, Priya Nair, and two outside lawyers who looked like men paid by the hour to enjoy silence. On our side were Paul, Dana, Marianne from Internal Legal, one board representative dialed in through video, and me. Dana still tried to open like it was her room. She smoothed her jacket, gave a tight professional smile, and started with, "Before we get into specific diligence points, I think it may be helpful if I summarize how the Halcyon team has approached the Helix transformation framework from a leadership perspective." It was classic Dana. Try to claim narrative control before anyone can pin her to details. But Helix's general counsel did not even let her finish. He lifted one hand and said, "That won't be necessary." Then he turned to me. "Ms. Grant, did you author the architecture assumptions that underpin the current transition exhibits and liability structure?" The room went completely still. That was the thing about truth in formal rooms. It never needed dramatic music. It only needed one clear question. "Yes," I said. "I did." Dana shifted in her chair, just slightly. The lawyer nodded once. "Please walk us through that." So I did. Not emotionally, not defensively, not like someone trying to win an argument. I answered by date, document, and meeting. I explained which workshops I led with Helix Operations, which risk sessions I ran with their labor, security, and legal teams, which memos I authored, which pricing reviews relied on my assumptions, which thresholds I certified before the liability model was finalized. Now, I laid it out in simple steps because that was how I built things in the first place. When I mentioned the continuity requirement between design and first phase validation, I explained it in plain English. If the same person who built the transition map is not the person validating the first 90 days, I said, then you're asking the client to trust a handoff instead of the original logic. That is fine for routine work. This was not routine work. Priya watched me without blinking. The general counsel asked, "And in your view, is replacing that person before execution a cosmetic change?" "No," I said. "It changes who can stand behind the model when the first real pressure hits. If something starts to fail, the person in that seat has to know why the assumptions were made. Yeah, not just what the summary says." That was the first moment I felt the room tilt, because everyone on Helix's side already knew I was speaking like the person who built it. Then the lawyer turned to Dana. "Ms. Mercer, can you identify the decision logic behind the rollback trigger in the Phase 1 transition path?" It was not a trick question. That was the brutal part. It was basic if you had actually built the model. Dana smiled the way executives smile when they need time. "Well, that trigger was established as part of our broader flexibility framework to ensure commercial adaptability during implementation." One of the outside lawyers wrote something down. Priya's expression changed first. Not dramatically, just enough to tell me she had heard the dodge. The general counsel asked again, more directly this time. What condition is that trigger designed to protect against? Dana paused. Then she started talking about implementation agility. Not the answer. She talked about executive oversight. Still not the answer. She used phrases like dynamic guardrails and integrated coordination, which was how people like Dana tried to fog a room when they did not have the map. I knew the exact moment she lost Helix. It was not when she failed. It was when Priya stopped looking at Dana and started looking at Paul, because that was the moment Helix's side understood this was not a fuzzy team credit dispute. Someone had put the wrong person in front of them and hoped language would carry the weight. Paul tried to save it. He leaned forward and gave them the CEO version of a cleanup job. I think it's important to see this as a collaborative leadership effort. And Dana has represented the integrated halcyon view throughout. Marianne cut in before he could finish. Paul, she said, calm as glass. The question is whether external authorship statements matched the documented record. Nobody in the room moved for about 2 seconds. That was longer than it sounds. Helix's general counsel looked at Paul and asked, Did Halcyon make external statements that Ms. Mercer personally architected this framework? Paul could not deny it. The press release existed. The investor call existed. Too many records already sat in too many inboxes. Yes, he said finally. And did those statements match the documented authorship record? That was the question that broke the room open. Paul did not answer right away because there was no clean answer left. Dana looked at him, waiting for rescue. He looked at Marianne, probably hoping for language. Marianne gave him nothing. I did not have to accuse anyone of fraud. I did not have to say theft, dishonesty, sabotage, or misrepresentation. I had already done the only thing that mattered. I had been precise, and precision was doing the damage for me. Helix's outside counsel flipped to a marked section and said, as things stand, we have a mismatch between documented authorship, staffing assumptions, and public representations. That creates review issues. The general counsel followed with the part that really landed. Helix will not proceed on current terms unless authorship, staffing authority, and governance are corrected immediately. If not, we reopen liability review in full. In plain English, that meant the deal was frozen, the risk pricing could blow open, and then Halcyon's board was about to understand just how expensive Dana's ambition had become. Nobody looked at me when those words landed. That told me everything. For days, I had been the woman they sidelined, softened, and pushed to the edge of the account. Now I was the one person in the room who still sounded credible. Dana sat there in silence, finally trapped inside the thing she thought she could fake. And I remember one very small, very satisfying detail. Slide 47 never came up. It did not need to. By then, the room already knew who built the structure and who only tried to stand in front of it. After the due diligence meeting, Halcyon moved the way companies move when they are not trying to do the right thing. They were trying to survive. The first call came from Marianne before I had even reached my car. She said the board's audit committee was opening a formal review tied to the Helix account, the external statements, and the staffing changes made before execution. Her tone did not change once. To her, this was not drama. It was exposure. Dana was removed from the account that afternoon. No announcement, no grand email. Just a revised distribution list, a changed org note, and one meeting invite where her name was suddenly gone. That is how real power leaves in corporate life. Not with noise, with access. Within 3 days, her compensation package was frozen pending review. Colin disappeared from transition calls as if someone had quietly decided never to mention him again. Paul tried to contain the damage by calling the whole thing a messaging issue in a board update, but that excuse did not last long. The records were too clean, and the sequence was too obvious. They had not stumbled into a misunderstanding. They had repeated a false authorship story after the legal sensitive structure of the deal was already tied to me. People inside Halcyon started speaking to me differently after that, carefully, not warmly, not bravely, just carefully. That was fine with me. I was not interested in apologies. Apologies are cheap once risk appears. I wanted structure. And for the first time in my career, I was in a position to demand it. Helix made that possible by being sharper than my own company. They did not ask for me to be thanked. They asked for me to be in charge. There is a big difference. The client needed the original architect leading mobilization. Halcyon needed the deal to close. The board needed the problem to stop growing. That is what leverage looks like when it finally becomes visible. Not revenge speeches, not dramatic exits, just a set of conditions nobody can afford to ignore. When the company finally asked what it would take for me to lead the Helix account into execution, I did not answer right away. I let them sit in the silence for a few seconds. Then I told them. I wanted formal authority over delivery governance for the account, not informal influence, not soft promises, actual authority. I wanted direct reporting on Helix outside Dana's old structure. I wanted the compensation they had cut restored in full, along with the portion tied to the pursuit they had tried to strip away. I wanted written authorship recognition in the client documents. I wanted non-retaliation language approved by counsel, and I wanted to choose my own core team. Now, Paul tried to negotiate at first. Of course he did. Men like him always think the woman who kept her balance under pressure will eventually settle for dignity and a nicer title. I had spent too many years being useful without being protected to make that mistake again. So I said no, calmly and more than once. In the end, they accepted every condition, not because they respected me, because they had run out of better options. Helix signed once the corrections were made. The deal did not close on Dana's face and Paul's talking points. It closed on clean governance, accurate authorship, and a client's refusal to trust the wrong people again. The internal review took longer, but the ending was never really in doubt after that. Dana was terminated for cause. The findings were not phrased in the satisfying language people use in fantasy stories. No one wrote villain, liar, or thief in a memo. Corporate documents never give you that kind of poetry, but the results said enough. False authorship claims, improper staffing actions, misaligned external representations on a live strategic account. Paul lasted 2 more quarters before announcing his retirement. That was the official line. Inside the company, everyone knew what it meant. He was leaving in a dark suit, with polite language wrapped around a hard push out the door. As for me, I did not take Dana's job. I took the structure above it. Halcyon created a new role for me, Chief Delivery Architect for Strategic Accounts. For the first time, my authority matched my responsibility. That sounds small if you have never lived the opposite. But in corporate life, invisible responsibility is how women like me get used. We carry the risk. We build the machine. We save the client. Then someone louder stands in front of it and calls herself leadership. That only works until the machine is forced to explain who built it. A few weeks after the deal closed, we had the formal Helix kickoff. There was no victory theater this time, no inflated speeches, no polished theft pretending to be strategy, just a working session, a clean table, and the final contract binder laid in front of me, not as support staff, not as the quiet woman behind the slides, not as where needed, as the person the client had insisted on trusting. I put my hand on the binder and looked around the room. Priya gave me a small nod. Marianne was there for part of the opening and said almost nothing, which was somehow more respectful than praise. And all I could think was how badly Dana had misunderstood the thing she tried to steal. She thought the spotlight was the prize. It never was. I was not the spotlight. I was the load-bearing structure holding the whole deal up. And the moment she tried to put her name where mine belonged, she exposed the one thing she could never fake when pressure finally arrived: authorship.